Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Pacific Update. My name is Sandra Tart from USP, and I'll be chairing this morning's plenary session. We have two very distinguished speakers who I'll be introducing to you shortly. You may not be aware, but there is a change of program in that one of the keynote speakers, Dr. Nicole Haley from ANU, was not able to travel to Fiji at the last minute. And very fortunately, we have Stephen Howes, who will be presenting a keynote instead. So thank you very much, Stephen, for stepping in at short notice. The format for this morning is that we will have the first keynote and then some time for discussion, any questions and comments, and then we'll move into the second keynote. And we should aim to finish by 10:30 for morning tea. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker. Laucala Quinisalani Toilupe Tango is the Director of the Social Development Program of the Pacific Community, focusing on the specific needs and different vulnerabilities of women, youth, and minorities within policy and program interventions at all levels in Pacific countries and territories. Previously, she worked as Chief Executive Officer in the Ministry of Women, Community, and Social Development in Samoa. Laucala's work as CEO involved facilitating strategic thinking and leadership to engage village communities in climate resilience planning and programming, both at national and local level. She has been actively involved in multiple local, national, and regional partnership initiatives involving civil society and institutions with the common goal of enhancing women and child protection actions, namely through the adoption of CEDAW recommendations. Laucala holds a bachelor's in social work from Massey University in New Zealand, a master in international social development from the University of New South Wales, and an advanced diploma in business management from the University of New England in Armidale, Australia. With more than 20 years of experience as a senior executive in the public sector, Laucala has participated in several international and regional forums, including at the United Nations, Commonwealth Secretariat, the African, Caribbean, and Pacific Secretariat, and Pacific Ministerial Forums. I'm also pleased to note that she is a member of the advisory board of the Oceania Center for Arts, Culture, and Pacific Studies here at USP, and also of the School of Social Sciences. Please welcome Laucala. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra, for that very extended version of my bio. I think you often speak at so many events and you give them your different bios to try and suit the context of the event, that when you hear these things at another event, you surprise yourself with what you've done so far. But anyhow, excellencies, distinguished delegates and participants, development partners, representatives of academic institutions, representatives of civil society and private sector organizations, students, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be speaking this morning as part of what is described as the premier forum for the discussion of important policy issues in the region. And I acknowledge the opportunity offered to us by the Australian National University to engage in the Pacific Update Forum. Ta'alofa lava, Nisambula Vinaka, good morning, and I extend to you all warm greetings from the Pacific community. Ladies and gentlemen, this forum is an opportunity for us to explore some of the key developments and policy issues pertinent to our region, including on regionalism, gender equality, economic development, climate change, labor mobility, and resource management. It allows us a platform to unpack these issues to some extent, and the conversation we had at the gender panel discussion yesterday also helped us reflect on the intersectionality of these issues, demonstrating the linkages across these areas and how we need to be reminded of the interconnectedness of these issues. As reaffirmed by our leaders, and I quote, "Our Blue Pacific seeks to recapture the collective potential of the region's shared stewardship of the Pacific Ocean based on an explicit recognition of its shared ocean identity, ocean geography, and ocean resources. Through the Blue Pacific, forum leaders seek to reaffirm the connections of Pacific people with their natural resources, environments, culture, and livelihoods," end quote. Ladies and gentlemen, our Blue Pacific identity reaffirms that as a collective with a shared identity, geography, and resources, we ought to be framing our policy, research, and practice within that Pacific context. And this indeed is our challenge, because we've become accustomed to operating in our silos, which not only defies our collective nature and identity as Pacific people, but it also therefore threatens the sustainability of our natural resources and subsequently our existence. Now, the focus of my address this morning is on gender in the Pacific, but I just wanted to begin by sharing some of my reflections on the broader Pacific Update strategic conversations towards helping find solutions to our challenges as a region. Now, in our Pacific context, we know that our women are given the highest regard in our diverse cultural contexts, in our matrilineal societies, and in terms of their many achievements across various areas of development. 2 years ago, SBC celebrated its 70th anniversary as an organization, and as part of that celebration, we initiated a 70 Inspiring Women campaign in recognition of how SBC has contributed to the advancements of gender equality and women's empowerments across different sectors. And it was also in acknowledgement of the contribution that women themselves have made to developments in different sectors across our 22 island member states. Now, what we found from this campaign, as you can imagine, is that the number 70 was far too small, and women in all their diversities are making some amazing and positive contributions towards sustainable developments in the Pacific region, and that is a known fact. The challenge is these contributions by women are often invisible, and so a lot more work is needed to tell these stories and communicate these achievements by women in the context of sustainable development in the Pacific. Now, related to the story on the 70 Inspiring Women campaign is the fact that in the last 2 decades, the Pacific has seen some positive gains in regards to progressing gender equality, whereby a lot more people are now openly talking about gender issues, some of which were traditionally and historically taboo in our societies. There is now more action in terms of policies and programs focused on addressing gender issues. The development of domestic violence legislations is a big gain for us in the last decade. And lastly, women are breaking the glass ceiling through accessing leadership roles across sectors, and including those sectors that are traditionally considered as dominated by men. Now, despite these developments, we all know that certain challenges remain. Gender-based violence continues to be one of the biggest development challenges in our region, with prevalence rates of more than 60% in Melanesia and more than 40% in Polynesia and Micronesia. As a region, how do we respond from a policy and research perspective to this gender issue? Is it still a research and policy consideration at this point? Or should our focus be dedicated to programmatic and service responses to elevate and enable solutions to the scourge of gender violence? On education, we know that our girls are doing better than boys in schools, with increased access to primary and secondary education. But we also know that despite girls doing well over boys in education, these outcomes are not necessarily translated to access to decent work and better employment outcomes for women. As the audience engaged in this conversation, how do we create the balance across education and employment outcomes? And what policy responses do we require to create a better situation for our girls and our women? Recently, the Pacific Skills Summit was convened here in Suva, and I imagine that some of the discussions at that summit would have touched on how we match skills training and educational opportunities to labor market demands and industry needs. And so how do we leverage these different opportunities to address this gender gap from a policy perspective? In terms of broader economic empowerments for women, the reality is there is increased levels of poverty and hardship, where it is estimated that 1 in 4 Pacific Islanders live below their national poverty lines. And as a result, there is increasing inequalities, there is the unequal burden of care work, social protection is a challenge, and employment rates for women are overall lower than men. Relative to women's health, the NCD epidemic is taking a toll on our people and our women. And while we are seeing some improvements in access to skilled medical personnel, access to health facilities, planned pregnancies, and access to modern methods of contraception, further social issues remain to be addressed. As a region, we still have high rates of teenage pregnancy. We need to do more in terms of support for survivors of sexual violence. Youth unemployment with a regional average of 23% compared to a global average of 12 to 13% is a major issue affecting young women in the Pacific, and we need to consider policy solutions in these areas of development. On the issue of gender and climate change, gender is a critical determinant of climate change vulnerability. Along with other characteristics such as age, education, and social status, gender determines a person's vulnerability to climate change, as well as their capacity to adapt. And because women and men have different experiences in terms of their power relations in society, their roles and responsibilities, it also means that their vulnerability and their adaptive capacity to climate change is not the same as men. And women are subsequently disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to think that this information is not new to you, and that through your work in the policy, research, or practice spaces, you would have come across this information and analysis already. The questions for us, though, are, do we have all of the data and evidence we need to inform our policy and interventions? What other data and evidence do we need to build our case? Another question that we ought to ask ourselves is, are our policy responses effective? Are they relevant and adequate to address the gender challenges our region faces? And if not, what can we do better? What could we do differently to obtain the results we want? And are there emerging opportunities to leverage our existing efforts and to elevate our policy responses? Now, in trying to find answers to these questions, we need to look within and search internally for some solutions. As Pacific people and as a region, we've continued to look outside for answers, and while there's a lot of value in doing that, our lessons to date show that some of these solutions may not be sustainable for you and I, and therefore, we need to continue to look within for solutions. By looking within for solutions, we mean examining our own value and belief systems, which are the basic foundations for our behaviors and actions as societies. This is about understanding where these values and practices come from, recognizing that often our practices which have become part of our cultures were developed at a certain time, in a certain period, in response to a particular situation at such a time. And that 20 or 40 years later, these practices which have now become part of our cultures, are no longer relevant and are no longer effective today. In closing, ladies and gentlemen, as we acknowledge the status of gender in the region today, we recognize that the changes that we need have to be transformational in terms of transforming the power dynamics and structures that serve to reinforce gendered inequalities. Our gender transformative approaches go beyond the symptoms of gender inequality to address the underlying social norms, attitudes, behaviors, and social systems. This approach entails engagements that critically examines challenging and questioning gender norms and power relations that underlie visible gender gaps. From a programming perspective, this approach is relatively new in Pacific Island countries and territories, pushing us out of our comfort zones and making us ask and answer difficult questions. Is what we are doing actually changing what needs to be changed? And if not, what else do we need to do as individuals, as a collective, and as Pacific member states in determining a sustainable future for our girls, for our women, and for us as part of the Pacific community? I thank you for your kind attention. Vinaka vakalevu soifua maemanuia.
Thank you very much, Laucala, for your presentation. The floor is now open. We have time for some discussion. And I just thought I might make one small intervention just to perhaps remind the audience that recently we had a visit to the region of the UN Secretary General, and he visited Fiji, and on his visit here he actually came to USP and met with students in this forum. The main focus was to discuss climate action and ahead of the summit in September. But the interesting point is that the only closed meeting he held while on this tour of the Pacific was actually with a group of women activists and civil society gender advocates, and that was here at USP. It was a closed-door session where they were able to speak freely with the Secretary General about the impacts of climate change on women and girls. So I think that was quite an important recognition on his part, at least, of that issue. So now the floor is open. Are there any questions or comments for the speaker? Is that Biman?
Thank you. My name is Biman Prasad. I think what we have seen in more recent times, in terms of public policy on climate change and gender itself, what worries me is while these issues are right on the agenda, right on the minds of our policymakers, researchers, what is missing out of that is how governance structures are supporting or not supporting these important issues, and how we are dealing with funding propositions, funding availability, and it's linked to the whole governance structure, and whether the overwhelming emphasis on policies and advocacy relating to climate change and gender, and especially the impact of climate change on women and children, we are missing the emphasis on proper governance, proper use of resources, efficient use of resources to deal with those issues. Thank you.
Okay. Did you want to respond or? Maybe a couple more. Yep, okay. Any other questions or comments? Satish.
Thank you, Chair. Satish Chand, USP and UNSW. My question is to you, Laucala. Thank you very much for your presentation. I totally agree with you that we have problems with data. I often hear many people saying that we don't have the data to assist us with evidence-based policy making, and I agree with you on that. The thing that is missing from the Pacific is that we do have a lot of data sitting within national statistics offices. And the Pacific community some 20 to 30 years ago was trying to build a regional database. So the question to you is, what has happened to that project? And why is it that we're still struggling in availing the data that has already been collected for research and for assistance with policymaking?
And third question or comment? Yep.
Thank you. My name is Michele Rondrondo from the private sector. You talked about the percentage of violence in the Pacific. Has there been any observation into the cultural diversity within the Pacific and also into the indigenous and how this correlates to the percentage that you have stated? Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll respond at that.
Okay, so thank you for the questions. Just in response to the comments around governance, I think one of the things that we recognize from a gender perspective, particularly in the conversations around climate change, is the fact that while we discuss the gendered impacts of climate change, a lot of the decisions and governance around climate change are all made and dominated by men. And that one of the things that we continue to push from our perspective is how do we increase the participation and engagement of women in those governance processes in the context of climate change. More broadly, in terms of our national governance systems and budgeting, there's one of the things we're moving into is strengthening the focus on gender responsive budgeting. While we have focused our efforts in the last 5 years in trying to strengthen gender statistics and the evidence to inform policies, public policies and gender policies, we also acknowledge that we're not linking that conversations to the budget process and the resource allocation systems in national governments. And so we hope that through those initiatives, we would try to make some impacts on how we govern our resources and distribution of resources to respond to issues and challenges. On the question around data, I'm aware that in SBC, yes, from our perspective, yes, there is a lot of data. The challenge is the analysis and dissemination of this data. I've got my colleague David Abbots from our Statistics for Development Division, and he may be able to help respond to some of the questions that you've asked about, specifically on the projects and where we are with that. But I do know from SBC's perspective that we are dedicating our efforts on the analysis and disseminating that information towards informing decision-making and policies. On the question on violence and looking at the cultural dimensions of violence, I mean, these pieces of research was done some 10 years ago, and that I don't actually have the direct responses to that question, but what I can say is, in trying to look for solutions to gender-based violence, we are looking at what are the strengths in our cultural context that could help us address this problem. Are there positive practices in our cultural settings that we can use to address the challenge of gender violence? Or are there social norms from a cultural perspective that we need to start challenging to help us address this issue moving forward? So maybe I'll just ask David to help respond to the issue around data, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just to respond to your question, one of the challenges that we have is that the data is in the NSO websites, and it's up to them to make that data available in our database. Now, that hasn't happened as much as we would have liked over recent years, because many of the NSOs have lost their capacity to update their websites because their IT specialists have moved on and they haven't been able to replace them. Right now, we have a relatively new staff member in our Statistics for Development division, and he will be working with the NSOs over the coming months and years to try and help them to bring their websites up to speed, so that we can have a complete exchange of information between the websites and our primary database. You can find a lot of information on the Pacific Data Hub, which is now going live, and I can make the link available to you for that. We are in the statistics division. We are also introducing a new platform based on the OECD's .stat SDMX software, and that will provide a new database for all the SDGs and ultimately all the indicators that were previously held in our National Minimum Development Indicator database, the NMDI, which has been on our website for some time. So there are a lot of developments going on in statistics at the moment to try and improve the availability of data on a whole range of topics. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take some more comments and questions if there are any. Eberhard, and then back to you.
Thank you very much. I heard a very interesting and inspiring presentation. Of course, I guess most of the people sitting here would fully agree with you and your analysis of the role and partly powerlessness of women in many parts of the Pacific Island. You started your presentation with our leaders, and there I have the question, are there any particular efforts to increase leadership roles for women, for example, in Parliament, affirmative action or reservation for women in Parliament? And my second comment would be on gender and climate change. Often the profiling is the vulnerability, the lack of capacities of women compared to men. I think a very positive research direction would also be the agency of women in the aftermath of disasters, and of course disasters relate closely to climate change. And I think acknowledging these efforts would also enhance the acceptance within the society, for example, within the rural societies, of women to really look at what work they do. And interesting, in connection to Cyclone Winston, there is hardly any information readily available on these aspects of dealing with disasters. I thank you so much.
Thank you. We've got another question or comment there.
Thank you very much. My question is really around the cost of, I guess, on the issue of domestic violence. to women. I think the UK came out with that assessment, and it was around the billions. Australia a couple of years ago did the same, and it was around 22 billion in the 1 year. And that has significantly refocused, in terms of around policies. So looking at the Pacific, and given the role of the SBC, is there any kind of considerations around the cost of domestic violence at either a national level, or supporting countries to understand that holistically, given the silos that you were talking about earlier? Thank you.
Okay, we'll take one last question from the floor, or comment. Okay.
Thanks. My name is Lori Dutta, and I'm with APTC. Thanks very much for your address this morning. I was really interested in your comment around the sort of lack of alignment between educational outcomes for women and their ability to connect that to employment. So I was wondering if you are aware of, or any efforts to really do research to look into what those barriers are to that transition. And also, in thinking about women in non-traditional areas of work, whether you think the policies that are, the policy environment that's currently in place in the Pacific is adequate, or does there need to be more done about addressing behavior change in terms of work culture? Or if you know of any efforts to do this, working with employers, industry, et cetera. Thanks.
Thank you for the questions. Okay, so the first question on increasing women's leadership in parliaments. There continues to be a number of things that are happening, and a number of awareness and advocacy programs led by different agencies around this issue, and DFAT's also funding one of the regional programs focused on increasing women's leadership in politics out of the Australian Parliament. So there's a number of efforts happening. Samoa is one of the first countries in the region that have put in place a temporary special measure through the constitutional amendment, allowing increasing more women in Parliament. So that's one example of what we're doing in the region. But we also recognize that we need to do a lot more in terms of advancing leadership by women in that space. On the comments around gender and climate change and the profiling around vulnerabilities, I do agree with you that we also need to highlight the strengths that women bring to the table in the aftermath of disasters, and that we know that's happening. But what we're wanting to emphasize is we need to recognize and understand and appreciate the gendered vulnerabilities that women have as a result of climate change, because we need to then develop policies and programs and conduct research that respond to those vulnerabilities and those gendered impacts. So that's important. In terms of the cost of domestic violence, I mean, this is a huge undertaking, and it's also costly to do that. The question that we need to ask is, do we need to undertake an expensive survey, an expensive piece of research to tell us what we already know? And so it's about also balancing the kind of interventions that we need to implement, and what would be most cost effective for our people and for our member states, recognizing their smallness, their vulnerabilities in terms of their economies, and so forth. The question on alignment between education and employment outcomes, Laurie, I don't have a response in terms of, is there enough research in this area? Perhaps the academics in the room will have a better response than me, or would know more than me. I'm aware that from our perspective, we are doing some pieces of work around increasing and improving our workplace cultures to enable more women to come to the table and to enable more women and encourage more women to apply for more leadership and senior roles. Yesterday, I mentioned an example of an initiative that we've started in SBC. It's called Women Supporting Women in Sustainable Development, and it came out of our Geosciences division. And the focus of the program is really to provide mentoring for young women within the organization so that they can be encouraged to take up sciences, careers in the fields of sciences across SBC. So that's one area of one example that where we're looking to promote an organizational culture that encourages and supports women's leadership in the scientific areas and areas that are traditionally known as dominated by men.
I'll now draw this discussion to a close, and I think please join me in thanking our first keynote speaker for her contribution. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our second keynote speaker for this morning. Stephen has asked me to do this a bit shorter. Stephen Howes is the Director of the Development Policy Centre and Professor of Economics at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. He served as Director of the International and Development Economics Program of the Crawford School from 2009 to 2014. Prior to joining the Crawford School, Stephen was Chief Economist at the Australian Agency for International Development. And he also worked from 1994 to 2005 at the World Bank, first in Washington and then in Delhi, where he was lead economist for India. In 2008, he worked on the Garneau Review on climate change, where he managed the review's international work stream. Stephen will be speaking this morning on the subject of labor mobility, jobs in the Blue Pacific. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Sandra, and Bula Vanaka. Good morning, everyone. I'm sure you weren't expecting to see me here this morning, and I wasn't expecting to be up here either, but here I am. We did have a late withdrawal, and I don't know much about democracy, which was Nicole's topic, but I'm always happy to talk about labour mobility. So that's my topic for today. Labour mobility, in fact, is a theme for this conference. Normally the Pacific Update just runs for 2 days, but this year we've added a third day, and that third day tomorrow is on labour mobility. And I hope that as many of you as possible will stay back for the third day, which should be very interesting. And the fact that we've got this third day, I mean, it both speaks to the strength of the update as an annual event, but also to the growing interest in labour mobility as a topic for the region. So in my presentation, I'm going to just give you a bit of an overview, a bit of a teaser for tomorrow, discuss some of the latest issues and debates. But also I thought I would link it to this idea of the Blue Pacific. I mean, labour mobility has now been talked about for quite a while, but the Blue Pacific seems to have come up in the last couple of years. And I was interested that Laucala began her presentation actually talking about the Blue Pacific. And these two have such a natural sort of synergy that I've been thinking for a while about how we can better link them. And this presentation has given me the opportunity to try and think those thoughts through. So that's what I want to do in the introduction. It's mainly about labour mobility, its potential and its problems. But just to begin with the Blue Pacific, I think it was an idea introduced by the Prime Minister of Samoa, and this is along the lines of, I think, the quote that Laucala had, but the Samoan Prime Minister said that for the Pacific region and its island countries, the ocean is crucial. Exercising a sense of common identity and purpose linked to the ocean has been critical for protecting and promoting the potential of our shared Pacific Ocean. It is this commonality, the fundamental essence of the region, which has the potential to empower the region through collective and combined agendas and action. And this idea was taken forward by the Secretary General of the Pacific Island Forum, who said the concept of the Blue Pacific offers a powerful new narrative around which we may organise and develop key regional policy and action for the collective benefits of our people. I see the possibilities now cohering around this concept. I'm excited by the potential. So that's the Blue Pacific. It's an emerging narrative around the Pacific. So how does labour mobility fit in to the Blue Pacific? Well, I think it fits in very well because of its historical importance. It's not something new, but also its future potential. It is growing. And I think to understand this, and there are a few tables and graphs, that's why I've got the PowerPoints. To understand the importance of jobs overseas, we need to start with the situation of jobs at home. And the sort of the harsh truth is that, as we all know, there just aren't enough jobs being created in Pacific Island countries. This is a table from a joint report we did with the World Bank in the Pacific Possible series. These figures are calculated by my colleague Richard Curtin, who's here. And you can see, for example, in Kiribati, there are 3,200 young people every year coming into the job market, but only 65 formal sector jobs being created. Now, not everyone has to have a formal sector job, but we know the absorptive capacity of agriculture in terms of labour is limited, and there aren't enough informal sector jobs either, and that's why we have those high levels of underemployment and unemployment, especially among youth, as Laucala mentioned, because it's combined with the rapid population growth and the youth bulge. The counterpart to there not being enough jobs at home is that Pacific Islanders have long travelled overseas for work. Right? This is not a recent development. And you can see this in the statistics because the stock of immigrants takes a long time to build up the stock as against the flow. The stock of immigrants to residents for the Pacific countries is very high for many of them. It's above 100% for Cook Islands, above 50% for Samoa and Tonga, above 20% for Marshall Islands, FSM, Palau and Fiji. It's almost 20% for Tuvalu. And as one result of that, a lot of these economies are dependent on remittances. Remittances are one of the top 3 sources of foreign exchange for a number of Pacific countries, and also Timor-Leste, who's fits into this sort of category. I'm sure there will be others if I had the data. But even for a relatively sophisticated large economy such as Fiji, with its dynamic economy, remittances are the second largest source of foreign exchange. So this is the Pacific tradition, and again I want to emphasise its historical nature. In that famous article, The Sea of Islands, by the Samoan scholar Epeli Huaofa in 1994, he wrote, "Islanders are broken out of their confinement, are moving around and away from their homelands. They're once again enlarging their world, establishing new resource bases and expanded networks for circulation." It's not all good news, and one aspect is that labour mobility opportunities are unevenly spread. So I mentioned the countries that have a large share of emigrants overseas to population, but at the other end, once you get past Tuvalu, you have Kiribati, Vanuatu, Solomons and PNG with hardly any stock at all. Again, I don't have data for all the countries, but you can see the very uneven spread of population here. And just to round out the story, it's also, there's also a lot of inward labour mobility into the Pacific, right? Especially in Palau and Cook Islands. Right? In Palau, 27% of the population is born overseas. In fact, that's higher than Australia. Australia is meant to have the highest ratio of foreign-born population in the world. But obviously whoever did that study didn't look at Palau, because Australia's at 26% and Palau's at 27%. Palau, Cook Islands, after that though, it falls away rather quickly. So it is mainly a story of outward migration, but for some countries, inward migration is also very significant. So why is that outward migration so significant in the Pacific? It goes back a long way, and even today the traditional mechanisms for labour mobility continue to be the most important. So there are a number of countries that have free and full labour market access either to New Zealand or to the United States. There are a number of other countries that have restricted access to New Zealand. And one interesting statistic that talks to the demand for migration is that this New Zealand scheme is a lottery. You have to apply. And there are 16 times as many applications as there are successful ones pulled out in the lottery. So there is a lot of demand to move. And then going beyond these specific schemes, once you have a diaspora overseas, you're able to much more readily use the general migration categories through diaspora facilitated access. So for example, Samoans and Tongans might migrate to New Zealand, become New Zealand citizens, and then they're able to migrate to Australia under the New Zealand-Australia arrangements. Many Fijians are able to migrate, for example, to Australia under the regular skilled migration category. So these are long-standing arrangements that have been to the benefit of the Pacific for a long period, but there have been some exciting developments over the last decade, which have, I guess, pushed labour mobility up the policy agenda. In particular, we've seen new seasonal worker labour mobility opportunities. The recognised seasonal employer program was started in 2007, and the seasonal worker program a year later in 2008. And between them, the two programs are now growing very rapidly. And the latest figures we have up to May of this year indicate a combined total of 25,000. And there's plenty more growth to come. It's hard to predict the future, but in our Pacific Possible report, we projected a total of almost 60,000 by 2040, and the recent numbers have been ahead of our projections. One interesting feature of the data this year is that the seasonal worker program is now as large as New Zealand's RSE. New Zealand's RSE grew much faster, more quickly, and for a long time, we were trying to understand why the SWP was so slow and small. But while the RSEs remain capped, that cap has been increased gradually over time. The SWP has been uncapped, and there has been very rapid growth in the SWP in the last couple of years, where it's more or less doubled in size, and it's now caught up with New Zealand, and next year it will no doubt overtake New Zealand. One good thing about these schemes is they have spread the labour mobility opportunities to countries that have not been the main beneficiaries of labour mobility before. So if you remember Vanuatu, which was right down the end of in terms of stock of emigrants to population, it's been the biggest sender of labour under these schemes. Tonga and Samoa were already countries with a high level of labour mobility, but what you don't see in this table are the Cook Islands, Marshall Islands, countries like that already have full labour market access. They don't need these schemes. So these schemes do play that important role of spreading the benefits of labour mobility through the region. Some countries are still missing out, for example, Papua New Guinea. But overall, the tendency of the scheme has been to push labour mobility opportunities to where they've been less abundant in the past. That's a very positive thing. Beyond the seasonal worker schemes, which were introduced just over a decade ago, we've now seen another sort of a tranche of schemes being launched. Last year, the Australian government launched the Pacific Labour Scheme, which provides opportunities really in almost any sector outside of the capital cities. And it's for non-seasonal work. It's for work up to 3 years. In fact, this graphic is a blog from the former Foreign Affairs Minister that she wrote for our blog when the scheme was launched, and I think we do have to give credit to Julie Bishop for her contribution in pushing the labour mobility agenda forward. It's still a very small scheme. Only 200 have come this first year, but it has a lot of potential for growth. There's also the APTC, now called the Australia Pacific Technical Coalition, which is now in its phase 3 and has what it calls the away track. The APTC was set up in 2006 or 7, always had a focus on labour mobility, but hasn't been able to deliver on that promise. If you look at the surveys of students at APTC, about 90% say they want to migrate, but only 1 or 2% actually end up getting a job overseas. So the APTC now, to rectify that, is going to introduce this away track, which doesn't give a guarantee of migration, but is for people who come in with an understanding that that's that's the outcome they're seeking, and that APTC will help them achieve it. Those are Australian initiatives, and on the New Zealand side, there's the Pacific Trades Partnership, which is a similar, somewhat similar scheme to the Pacific Labour Scheme, obviously with a focus on trades. In general, the idea of these is to go beyond seasonal agriculture, whether it's non-seasonal agriculture, trades, hospitality, aged care, fishery, abattoir work, extend the range of occupations open to the Pacific. So, to sum up so far, labour mobility historically has been important for the Pacific, growing in numbers, spreading across countries, and of enormous benefit, given the shortage of jobs at home. And I do really, derive the labour mobility agenda from this jobs perspective. I know some people will link it to climate change, and that may sort of further the imperative for migration, but I think the really pressing need is for employment. There's a natural link from labour mobility to the Blue Pacific. They both involve travel, they both involve the oceans, and in the case of labour mobility, travel over the oceans. So the question then is, why doesn't labour mobility feature more strongly in Pacific regional fora and resolutions? Every now and then it pops up, but it's not really a main focus. What's holding it back? I think one issue is the graph I showed before, that different countries have such different opportunities. Some countries if you've got full labour market access to the United States, you don't really need anything else in terms of labour mobility. You're going to be more worried about brain drain in the domestic economy. But if you're isolated and you've got a lot of unemployment like the Solomon Islands, you're going to be a lot more interested in labour mobility. So I think there are those divergent interests that have held the Pacific back. But beyond that, there are also a number of criticisms of labour mobility, right? A number of critiques that result in it losing support. And I want to address these one by one, not to suggest they're not real or important, but they're certainly worthy of critical attention. So I've got 7 of these critiques that I've encountered in my work around labour mobility. The first is that there are just not enough overseas jobs, especially for the larger economies, that labour mobility is never really going to make a serious difference, and the jobs, if they're going to come, have to come domestically. Now, it is possible, that's what this graphic shows, that in the future, all our fruit and vegetables will be picked by robots. And if that's the case, then labour mobility may not have a promising future. We'll all be in trouble if the robots take over. But that remains a matter of speculation. I think the jury's still very much out on the impact of automation. So we only have the historical record really to go by, and the historical record is really much more positive, that there are enough overseas jobs to make a significant contribution. So just take the example of Tonga. In Tonga, about a quarter of all young men aged 20 to 45 leave the country every year to work on Australian and New Zealand farms, right? It must be the country's biggest occupation. That is a really, very transformational development, well beyond anything any aid program could deliver. But labour mobility can also make a huge difference to much bigger countries. I gave the example of Fiji earlier, but we can also look at much bigger countries outside the Pacific, such as the Philippines or Nepal, which have, say in the Philippines, say 10% of the population overseas, and remittances above 20% of GDP. And the Philippines is a good example because for a long time, labour mobility was seen as sort of a prop for a poorly performing economy, which in many ways it was, but in recent years, the Philippines economy domestically is doing much better. And labour mobility is now part of a much more positive overall story. A second critique revolves around exploitation. I'm sure you've seen newspaper stories like this one. Slavery claims of seasonal workers from Vanuatu paid nothing for months' work. This is an Australian story. And it's certainly true the Pacific workers often take on jobs that locals don't want. I mean, that's where a significant number of the jobs, the unskilled jobs, come from. Australians, by and large, don't want to go and pick fruit on a farm, and Americans don't want to go and work in a chicken factory, which is where many Marshall Islanders work, in Arkansas in particular. So these are often difficult jobs, and there are cases of exploitation. This newspaper article was, actually went to court, and there was a court ruling on it. But overall, I'm much more positive than the sort of exploitation narrative would suggest, In the specific case of seasonal work, both RSE and SWP are in fact part of a clean-up of the horticultural sector in New Zealand and Australia respectively. It happened much earlier in New Zealand, before and as the scheme was launched. It's taken longer in Australia. But one reason why the Australian scheme is growing so quickly, we think, is that as a result of exposés, not so much around seasonal workers, but more around backpackers and other illegal workers, as a result of media exposés, there's been a real crackdown in Australia on labour hiring practices on our farms. And that's come from the federal government, from state governments, and from suppliers. And that's made farmers rethink their labour market strategy and has made the regulated option, which the seasonal worker program is, it's the most regulated source of labour in horticulture, it's made that much more attractive, or at least much less unattractive, right? Because it's harder to get away with the unregulated option. So I think there is a very positive story there, but not to say that exploitation isn't a risk, but there are mitigating measures both sending and receiving countries can take, whether it's in terms of worker education or in terms of oversight and enforcement mechanisms in the receiving country. The third critique is that is a sort of a gender one, that labour mobility might provide jobs, but it's skewed in the gender composition. It's mainly jobs for males. That's not true in general. Migration opportunities for the Pacific are not intrinsically biased to men, because most people migrate as a family, and in fact you have even numbers of men and women. It is true for seasonal labour, and you have less than 20% of the workforce made up of women. That is an issue. It should be better addressed by the Pacific Labour Scheme, which has other occupations where women are more prevalent in the workforce. But there has been this interesting change just in this year's data in the seasonal worker program that I thought I'd share, that after being at around 14% for several years, the share of women actually jumped up to 18%. And when I looked into why that is, the real change was in Tonga, which is the second largest centre of labour, and the share of women in the Tonga labour force has jumped up in 1 year from 10 to 17%. So that's a very interesting shift in the composition of the Tongan SWP workforce, and it does suggest that migration can drive change and make work that previously wasn't acceptable for women now something women are permitted or socially permitted or indeed encouraged to do. Fourth issue is around family separation, and this is a problem for schemes where families are not allowed to accompany the worker, and especially if it's for a longer period. And so this is and will be an issue for the Pacific Labour Scheme, and the graphic here is of the E-Kiribati workers at Hamilton Islands who came on the precursor to the Pacific Labour Scheme called the Microstates Visa. This group, mainly women, come for a period of 3 years without their families, and they're only able to go back for that 4-week holiday period. So this is an issue. I mean, surely, family separation can't be intrinsically a good thing, and you can imagine it would lead to problems for children as well as for partners. Again, there are mitigation strategies. I mean, one is to restrict these unaccompanied opportunities just to short-term migration, to the seasonal migration, where it's a matter of months rather than years that the separation goes on. The other is to promote permanent migration, where the family comes. And the other, again, is, as we do in our other temporary migration programs in Australia, to allow the family to come if it's a multi-year migration. But yeah, I think this is a real issue, and it will be an issue for the new Pacific Labour Scheme. The fifth issue is brain drain. Again, I'm sure you're familiar with this, and here's a recent headline. Even with the seasonal worker program, which is meant to be unskilled, there are complaints that teachers are leaving their jobs, government officials are leaving their jobs, and so there's a call in Vanuatu that only the unemployed should be allowed to take part in the seasonal worker program. Brain drain is a very complex issue, and people often take very polarised positions, either that it makes them dead against labour mobility, or they dismiss it and talk about potential for brain gain. I think we need to find the middle ground, certainly for smaller countries and where migration opportunities are unrestricted. There is a real risk of brain drain. At the same time, there are mitigation strategies. Obviously, worker selection is one. In the World Bank evaluation of the seasonal worker program, they found about 20% of seasonal workers were in paid employment prior to departing. They also found large variation across countries, suggesting that countries can put in place selection methods to minimise, to better target the seasonal worker program. In terms of skilled migration, the real solution is increased education funding. Right? If you've got more skilled people leaving, you need to boost your education funding. You need to find resourcing for that. That's going to be a challenge, but that is ultimately the solution. Inward migration can be part of the solution. Changes in domestic policy to make work at home more attractive, for example, issues around the retirement age. And then I think there are also obligations on donors and recipients of skilled migrants to implement net skill gain policies to make sure they're not contributing to brain drain. And that is actually a philosophy, as I understand, of the APTC. As it moves forward to promote labour mobility, it wants to also be able to demonstrate that it's making a net skill gain, so it's not open to this criticism that it's in fact exacerbating brain drain. Sixth is, some people distinguish between temporary and permanent migration, and that they like temporary migration because it's circular and people return, whereas permanent migration is seen as a permanent loss to the economy, and so something to be discouraged. I don't buy these arguments. I think both temporary and permanent migration can be great. They can also both have problems of their own. And temporary migration certainly has issues. It doesn't lead to that cumulative impact. It doesn't lead to the development of a diaspora, which then facilitates future migration opportunities. It doesn't necessarily solve the brain drain problem. It requires much more micromanagement on the part of government because you've got to go for a specific job. And it is more prone to exploitation because of the link between your work status and your visa. And finally, this is sort of the most fundamental critique of labour mobility's idea of a remittance trap. This is a bit like the natural resource curse. You think it's good for a country to have oil. What could be bad about that? But when you look around the world, you can see, well, actually, perhaps you're better off not having oil because of some of the unintended consequences. And the idea here is that, migration sounds like a good thing, but in fact, perhaps it also has unintended consequences. We've already talked about the brain drain. It can also lead to Dutch disease. Those inward remittances push up the exchange rate, make the economy uncompetitive. And then in terms of governance, it's argued that a high level of migration demotivates citizens and governments. The citizens, just sit back and rely on the remittances. And if they're unhappy, rather than changing the government, they leave the country. So there's a negative impact on governance. This is a controversial issue. There's certainly some evidence for the remittance trap around the world. But like a lot of these cross-country comparisons, it's difficult to get to the bottom of it. I know some of my colleagues are more concerned about the remittance trap than I am. If we really wanted to see if there was a remittance trap, we need to do a controlled experiment and give some countries a lot of labour mobility access and other countries not very much. And then those countries that have a lot would fall into this trap and on average do worse. In the Pacific, we have something like this controlled experiment, a natural experiment, that some countries have historically had much better access than others. Now, it's a small sample. You have to be careful in the inferences you do. But if you look at this graph, I've divided the countries up into those with open access, those with good access, and those with low access. And then just looking at their GDP as a sort of outcome indicator, the two countries with actually the highest GDP are two of the ones with open access, Palau and Cook Islands. And the ones with low access have very low GDP per capita. So the results seem, sort of somewhat all over the place, but not really supportive of this idea that there is a remittance trap. So those are the 7 criticisms, and some of them I want to argue against, but others I think are useful as a way of assessing different schemes. They're not, to me, arguments against engaging in labour mobility, but they're arguments about which schemes are better than others. I don't have time to develop this But you can rank some of these different schemes and then look at the different criteria, such as gender equity, brain drain, family separation, and you can start to rate them against these criteria, and then you can argue about which scheme is better. And, you know, I won't go through this. This is just some initial thoughts, but I will highlight the New Zealand Pacific Access category, which is this lottery system. It does seem to be, it's very good on gender equity. It doesn't promote brain drain because of that lottery system, and it doesn't involve family separation. And I've long advocated that Australia should follow New Zealand's example and introduce a similar sort of system. So I think my time's up. I need to wrap up. You know, I've been trying to suggest that labour mobility has a lot of potential. There are problems with it, but those are ones that should be managed rather than avoided. You know, if the Pacific regional institutions were to embrace labour mobility as a more important agenda, you know, what are the sort of things that could be done at the regional level? You know, I'm not an expert on Pacific regionalism and whether this should be done by the forum or there's now an annual labour mobility meeting with Australia and New Zealand. So you can discuss sort of where these activities should happen. But the sort of regional activities that I think would be useful are, first of all, to coordinate negotiations with Australia and New Zealand. I mean, the Pacific does gain when it negotiates as a bloc. And it made a lot of progress in labour mobility when Australia wanted to negotiate PACE Plus, and the Pacific was able to push back with its labour mobility demands. And the Pacific still has a lot of leverage, or perhaps even more leverage, because of the perceived strategic competition from China. Labour mobility is not something China can really offer, but Australia and New Zealand can. Certainly if I was in the Pacific, I would try to negotiate with New Zealand to get it to lift or even remove its cap on the RSC. As I mentioned, I would put pressure on Australia to introduce a New Zealand-type Pacific window. And I think it is odd that neither country, as far as I'm aware, has a backpacker visa, which is so popular, especially in Australia, but doesn't have a backpacker visa for the Pacific countries. Looking beyond those negotiations, a regional institution could help find new labour market opportunities beyond Australia and New Zealand and promote the Pacific as a labour supplier. It could help relatively isolated countries to sort of catch up. It could promote intra-Pacific labour mobility, you know, help Pacific Islanders get into the Cook Islands and Palau in particular. And it could facilitate some of the learning around these questions of exploitation and brain drain and what is good practice for a ascending country. So there's certainly, I think, a very useful role that regional institutions could play in regard to labour mobility that is currently, you know, a bit of a gap. So just to wrap up, I want to go back to the quote I started with from the Samoan Prime Minister, that for the Pacific region and its island countries, the ocean is crucial. And my point is the ocean has long been crucial for employment in the Pacific, and that is the Pacific's most pressing need. While local labour markets remain weak, labour mobility opportunities overseas are growing. Certainly labour mobility is not costless, but the challenges, in my view, the challenges need to be managed, not avoided. It is true that different Pacific Island countries face very different labour mobility challenges, just because some have so much of it already and others very little, and that will make collective action difficult. But that said, most Pacific Island countries do have an interest in enhanced labour mobility opportunities, as you can see by their interest in the seasonal worker program and the Pacific Labour Scheme. And to this extent, I think labour mobility should be a core component of the Blue Pacific narrative. It does bring jobs into the Blue Pacific. So Vanaka Vakalevu, thank you very much, everyone. And I will just say, if you're interested in labour mobility, we have a lot of blogs and we have a monthly newsletter. So just go to our website and please sign up. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. As you know, tomorrow there is a workshop focusing on labour mobility research. So today I think was a very good overview of some of the issues and questions for further discussion. But we do have time, 15 minutes before morning tea, so if there are any comments or questions from the floor? Please raise your hands. So we'll take 3 to begin with and then come back. Sorry, up the back? Yep, the back there.
Testing. Hi, I'm Milioni Wera from Tonga. Just wanted to ask a question. I note from your presentation in terms of gender participation, and in Tonga's case, there's an increase in the pattern from 10 to 17% or 18%. While it's good in terms of the gender participation and the increase in terms of women, have there been any thought to the sending countries and the impact it may have in the absence of mothers from the household and the absence of women in general from the households for a long term of, for that lengthy period of time? Currently, it's probably the visa is up to 9 months, but then when you look at your labor scheme that you're introducing, I understand you touched on separation of families, but I'm more interested in terms of just for women alone and their absence from the household and the impact that it may have in the long run on the households and the sending countries. Thank you.
Okay, 2 more before we go back. We'll come back to you. Up the back there. Yeah. And
Thank you very much for the presentation. I find it very interesting because it helps me put into perspective where the small island states in the broader picture. My interest is from the small islands perspective. How do we increase participation? But I want to just make a few comments and then maybe proceed to some questions. First of all, if I can share experiences from Kiribati, and I know it concerns the education system, the TVET system, the vocational training and education, because we have a formal education system that sort of trains up young people to become doctors and lawyers and whatnot, but the majority that leave the formal education sector end up jobless. Only a handful of people get scholarships, but the majority still remain idle after school. So are we reviewing our education systems as much as possible to tailor the needs of school leavers after school? So life is not only practical after school, but it's also able to help them adapt to change and get jobs, use their skills, whatever talents they have to get an employment. You don't have to be a doctor, you don't have to be a lawyer. But the problem is we sort of have a bias towards educating our children to become doctors and lawyers, if I can share that experience from Kiribati. The other thing is I've seen an emerging, focus in Kiribati on labor mobility and the role that the TVET sector strengthening program has played. But I've worked with the Labor Ministry for some time, and the problem is that we're training and training and training without connecting the training to jobs. So how do we get the labor demand on the market much more accessible? How do we say Australia and New Zealand, what is the trend in labor today? Is it still nursing and aged care? Can we review that and then maybe tailor the training needs accordingly? So this is the problem that I find. And then the other problem that I want to also mention is the gap, besides the brain drain that was mentioned. I think there's also a gap because when we build up the skills and upskilling process in the countries, what we have is the bulk. I saw the Kiribati 2% employment participation overall. So we're training all these people, but the majority, their skills are too high for the country to take on because they're actually trained using infrastructure and technology that are not matchable to the ones that we have in the country. So just some thoughts that I want to contribute, and I think it's really helpful for us to, ask the forum leaders, for example, regional crops, Australia and New Zealand, to sort of increase more policies to underscore the need for increased participation. And as the presentation said, you're very right. We have been seafarers for times immemorial. I mean, we have been seafarers ever since we were discovered. So this is a part of us. We have been traveling to look for jobs, whether inter-island or across borders. My last comment, and this is an area that I really have taken interest in, but I sort of get a few, loss of hope every time I see the participation rates of small island states. But how can labor mobility help, not just in terms of economic growth, but how can we make it a form of adaptation to climate change? For other countries, there are higher grounds where they can move to. For a small island, for example, we've got to consider adaptation beyond borders. How can the labor seasonal work scheme or progressing to permanent schemes contribute to that? Thank you.
Thank you. Another one there, and then.
Kia ora, thanks, Stephen. It's Regina Scavens from Development Studies at Massey University. I had the pleasure of supervising a PhD student who looked at the RSC scheme workers some from Tāna and Vanuatu working in New Zealand. And one of the things he found, and I really enjoyed your presentation, I liked your working through those different criticisms of labour mobility schemes. One thing that he found that I didn't see there was inequality on individual islands, on some of the sending islands, and so where contractors have obviously developed strong relationships with some communities, some villages, and others miss out. That was something that he found was, and he'd had a long-term relationship with people on Tāna from being a VSA and other things as well. So he thought that was something that needed to be taken into account. So I'm wondering if anyone's done any work on that.
Thank you. I'm Muriel from Vanuatu, and I'm interested in the permanent migration issue, and agree with you to support permanent migration. My question is there any possibility for both receiving country, Australia and New Zealand, to be flexible on the visa requirement for seasonal workers and the semi-skilled workers under the PLS program? Taking from Vanuatu perspective and experience, though we are the largest sending country in the Pacific region, we do have so many social issues resulting in the seasonal workers program scheme, such as broken homes, family separation, and the most vulnerable victims are women and children. So I believe if both sending countries and receiving countries to work together in partnership and establish probably some program in place to support the families remaining back home on how they can cope with that long separation. My second query is how can we improve or strengthen the pastoral care programs, and is it more effective to engage churches, NGOs, union, or do we only have to leave it to government rep, such as liaison officers in Australia or New Zealand? And coming from Vanuatu's experience, we don't have any liaison officer in New Zealand and Australia, and it's a very costly exercise for us because many workers are scattered in different states in Australia, and my government cannot fund the secondment trip or visit for the liaison officer to visit all area workers in Australia or New Zealand just to check on the status of accommodation, condition of work, living. This is the only query that I have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll ask Stephen and Litwa to respond.
Oh, thank you everyone for those questions. I mean, the first thing I'd say is come along to the workshop tomorrow because a lot of these issues are going to be discussed. We've got a whole session on social impacts, and we have a session on skills, and we have a session on sending country governance. So a lot of these issues sort of you could slot them under those different categories. There are also sessions on sort of what has been researched, what should be researching. So we are really looking for ideas. So please, if you've got any interest at all, do come along and ask your questions again. I mean, the second thing I want to say is that I'm not an expert on all aspects of labour mobility. I don't want to pretend to be an aspect, you know, and especially around the social issues. There are people here actually who've studied that a lot more than me. And I welcome any contributions from Rochelle or any other colleagues who'd like to go to that issue. I mean, I agree family separation is an issue. I don't think the answer, you know, if you're going to have a seasonal worker program, the answer can't be, well, the men will go overseas and the women will stay home. I mean, that doesn't seem to be the approach. So if we're going to have a seasonal worker program and there's massive support for the program and demand for it, then, you know, how can families and their communities cope? How can they minimise any damage that might be done? I think that's the way to frame it, but as I said, I welcome other contributions. In terms of small states, I mean, there were some excellent comments you made, and we could discuss it a lot more. I mean, Cook Islands is a small state, and it has the highest rate of outmigration of any of the Pacific Island countries, I think. So I don't think there's any necessary barrier, you know, just that you're a small state, a necessary barrier against labour mobility. It really comes down to, you know, what access you've been able to negotiate or you've been provided, and definitely, you know, Kiribati, to some extent Tuvalu, Nauru have missed out on those arrangements that have allowed Cook Islands to thrive. But I think all the issues you raise are very pertinent. I mean, I just pick up one which is about training and then people not ending up in jobs. You know, I think that's something we've seen the data on that. And we've certainly seen that with labour mobility. I think one issue with the APTC, people thought you just give students an Australian qualification, they can migrate to Australia. And migration is a lot more complicated than that. You need an entire pathway. And so I that just goes to your point. It's not as simple as train someone and they'll get a job, whether it's at home or overseas. On the issue of inequality, yes, I mean, that's certainly an issue. I guess I couldn't list every issue on my presentation, but that is one that you hear, and it will be discussed tomorrow. There is a bit of a tension because the seasonal worker program, it's not just a one-off scheme. It's not that people go for 1 year and that's it. The average seems to be around 3 or 4. Employers sort of check out the workers the first year, and the second year they invite back the good ones. And not only that, but they ask the good ones to recruit their workers, because that good worker is now trusted, and you'll trust their decisions. So of course they will then nominate their relatives and friends, and that does lead to this inequality that you describe. There's no obvious solution. Timor takes a more government-dominated approach. There are still return workers, but you can only recruit from the new workers from the work-ready pool. But one thing our research has shown is that those countries that have a high rate of return workers also get more new workers, because the scheme's working well, employers want to recruit there, and it grows. So, yeah, there are just some thoughts around that inequality issue. On permanent migration, you know, I agree that it shouldn't be seen as a bad thing. Often permanent migration happens, the pathway is through temporary to permanent migration. For example, 20% of backpackers who come to Australia end up migrating to the country, right? Because again, employers get to know someone while they're a temporary migrant. If they like them, they'll sponsor them for permanent migration. The SWP or RSE doesn't have that route to permanent migration. Maybe the PLS will in some occupations if they are at the higher end of the skill dynamic. But for the moment, we know we have the PLS, so we have to try and make it work, and we have to see whether it can be a bridge to permanent migration. And then finally on pastoral care, yeah, I think you gave the answer. I mean, you know, Tonga has liaison officers. I think Samoa does in New Zealand, Timor-Leste does, and Vanuatu, as the biggest supplier to both to the SWP and RSE, you know, we think this is a big industry for countries, for some countries, and although it's mainly private sector led, government does need to play that facilitating role. And does need to invest some resources into it. And yeah, I think Vanuatu could consider a liaison officer, at least one, in Australia and in New Zealand.
Sorry, if I may. I just wanted to pick up on the comments from Kiribati about those young people that don't continue on to university or don't end up with a job. to talk about one of the things that SBC has just started doing in terms of developing micro-qualifications. And this is in recognition of the fact that we do engage in a lot of short-term courses in our region that doesn't often end up in an accredited qualification that you can use to look for a job or use to provide or will provide you with a pathway to a higher qualification. And so that's one thing that we have started to do in SBC through our education quality assessment program. We are also looking at doing some work around our Youth at Work program to link the micro-qualifications to the training that we provide for young people, particularly those who are not in education, employment, or training. So you might be interested in reaching out to our ECAP people who can provide more information on the micro-qualification. I wanted to come back to your question in one of your slides where you asked the question, why doesn't it feature more strongly in Pacific Regional Fora? Why doesn't labor mobility feature strongly in regional fora? In my view, I think this goes back to what I was saying before about our siloed approach to things, and that from a crop perspective, I'm aware that labor mobility sits under the trade area in the Forum Secretariat. And the question for us from a youth development perspective and a gender equality perspective, why do we have to limit the conversation within that context, but why don't we broaden the conversation so that we can look at how labor mobility then impacts on creating employment for young people and also creating opportunities for women? So I think it comes down to how we frame the conversation around labor mobility, and that for a very long time, we've limited that conversation to trade, we've limited that conversation to commerce and labor, and we haven't really exploited the opportunities across the different sectors to have that conversation and to increase visibility of labor mobility in our region.
Okay, I think on that very positive note, we will draw this to a close. I'd like you to please join me in thanking our speakers once again. Thank you very much. And thank you all, and please join us for morning tea outside. Thank you.
No, that's good. Yeah, because so it's kind of, doesn't really fit under trade, right?
Again, it's framing and how do we, because if we frame it in this way, then it doesn't get picked up from the other conversations.
Yeah.
Some great linkages there.
You know, I think this is the first time we've had a session, keynote on the update, as far as I can remember. So that was pathbreaking. Yeah, it was good. You had a speech, right? So can you pass that on?
Yeah.
We can put that up. That would be great. Yeah.
One thing I forgot to pass on.
No, Rich is going to critique my.
No. I do that behind doors.
Close session.
That when we went to the National Employment Centre yesterday, they said that Ben at the Pacific